I spent most of my professional life inside institutions that claim to value precision, restraint, and sober judgment. Intelligence, when done correctly, is supposed to reduce uncertainty, not manufacture confidence. Yet, what I have watched over the last 2 decades is a steady transformation of American strategy into something performative, less about shaping outcomes and more about projecting dominance for domestic consumption. Venezuela, Greenland, and the repeated invocation of an American iron fist are not coherent strategic priorities. They are stage props. They exist to reassure audiences at home that control still exists even as the underlying systems that once produced real leverage are hollowed out. The observation is simple. Policy announcements now precede intelligence analysis, not the other way around. Intelligence is retrofitted to justify decisions already made, and uncertainty is treated as disloyalty. That inversion produces predictable distortions. Analysts learn quickly that questioning assumptions about control, deterrence, or escalation carries institutional risk, while affirming them carries reward. The strategic consequence is not immediate collapse, but cumulative blindness. When power is framed as something you demonstrate rather than something you manage, every action must look decisive, regardless of whether it actually improves the balance of forces. That is how energy leverage becomes a substitute for diplomacy, how legal rhetoric replaces political strategy, and how geography itself is turned into a talking point rather than a constraint. The analytical breakdown here is uncomfortable but unavoidable. American institutions increasingly confuse motion with effectiveness. Sanctions are imposed because they signal resolve, not because intelligence shows they will produce compliance. Military language is escalated because it deters critics, not adversaries. Control is asserted rhetorically because measuring it empirically would expose its limits. Inside the system, this feels like confidence. Outside it, to allies and adversaries alike, it looks like improvisation backed by force. The hard lesson is one intelligence professionals are trained to understand, but policymakers prefer to forget. Credibility is not generated by volume or repetition. It is generated by accuracy over time. Once intelligence becomes a tool of narrative maintenance rather than risk assessment, strategy stops being a means to an end and becomes theater. And theater, no matter how forcefully staged, cannot substitute for a strategy that actually aligns power, interests, and reality. Venezuela has become a textbook example of how intelligence language is bent to legitimize decisions that are fundamentally political. When policymakers describe actions there as law enforcement or clean diplomacy, they are not clarifying intent, they are obscuring it. I have watched this pattern before. You redefine a strategic objective in narrow legal terms, then use intelligence selectively to argue that the objective has already been achieved. In Venezuela's case, the claim is control of oil flows, control of financial access, control of regime behavior without the inconvenience of occupation or overt war. The intelligence distortion begins with the assumption that economic leverage functions like a precision instrument. It does not. Sanctions, seizures, and conditional access to markets are blunt tools that generate adaptive behavior, not compliance. When intelligence reporting highlights interdictions or short-term revenue loss while downplaying substitution networks, third-party intermediaries, and illicit trade, it creates an illusion of dominance. The strategic consequence is overconfidence. Policymakers begin to believe that control exists because it has been asserted repeatedly, not because outcomes have changed. From an analytical standpoint, this is where narrative replaces measurement. You stop asking whether the regime's behavior is altered in durable ways and start asking whether your actions look decisive on television. Law enforcement framing plays a crucial role here. It allows policymakers to bypass questions of sovereignty, escalation, and long-term governance by collapsing them into the language of criminal justice. Intelligence is then tasked not with evaluating strategic effects, but with validating the legality and optics of the move. Inside the system, this feels orderly. Outside it, it signals unpredictability. Adversaries do not interpret these actions as neutral enforcement, they interpret them as power projection by other means. Allies interpret them as precedents that may one day be applied to them. The analytical breakdown is straightforward. Energy leverage is being treated as a substitute for political settlement. That assumption ignores decades of intelligence showing that regimes under pressure do not capitulate. They recalibrate, they harden internally, diversify externally, and shift costs onto populations while preserving elite control. The hard lesson Venezuela reinforces is one the intelligence community once understood well. Coercion without a credible political end state is not strategy. It is pressure for its own sake. And when intelligence is used to mask that absence, it stops warning policymakers where the cliff edges are and starts cheering them as they accelerate toward them. Sanctions policy rests on a seductive premise that financial pressure can be calibrated to produce political obedience without the costs of war. Intelligence assessments are supposed to test that premise against reality. Instead, what I have seen is intelligence used to protect the premise itself. When sanctions are imposed alongside cartel designations and financial interdictions, success is often defined by activity rather than effect. Assets seized, accounts frozen, shipments intercepted, these become proof points in briefings, while the harder question is quietly sidelined. Has anything actually been controlled? The observation is that control is asserted through process metrics, not outcome metrics. Intelligence failure enters when analysts are encouraged to treat disruption as resolution. Cartels adapt faster than bureaucracies. Financial networks fragment, reroute, and reconstitute. Pressure does not eliminate them, it professionalizes them. Yet intelligence reporting frequently emphasizes tactical friction while minimizing strategic resilience. This distortion is not accidental. It aligns neatly with a political narrative that promises dominance without entanglement. The strategic consequence is policy inertia. Once sanctions and designations are framed as instruments of control, reversing or revising them becomes politically impossible, regardless of evidence. Admitting limited impact would imply that leverage was overstated, and overstated leverage undermines the image of command. The analytical breakdown reveals a deeper institutional problem. Intelligence is increasingly asked to confirm intent rather than assess capability. When policymakers want to believe that labeling a cartel or choking a revenue stream equates to strategic victory, intelligence is shaped to make that belief defensible. Over time, this creates a feedback loop. Each new designation justifies the last. Each seizure proves resolve, and the absence of behavioral change is explained away as proof that more pressure is needed. Meanwhile, adversaries learn the pattern. They factor sanctions into their operating costs, build redundancy into their networks, and exploit the political constraints that prevent policymakers from admitting failure. The hard lesson here is brutal but necessary. Control is not something you declare. It is something you can sustain against adaptation. Sanctions and cartel designations can be tools, but they are not substitutes for strategy. When intelligence stops distinguishing between disruption and control, policymakers lose the ability to tell whether they are shaping the environment or merely performing dominance within it. And once that distinction is lost, escalation becomes the default response to every unmet expectation, not because it works, but because it preserves the fiction that control was always within reach. Greenland exposes another dimension of America's strategic drift, the tendency to inflate geography into destiny when narrative convenience demands it. From an intelligence perspective, Greenland's role in missile defense and early warning has been well understood for decades. It is important, but it is not mystical. What has changed is not the geography, but the way it is discussed. Strategic language now treats physical terrain as if asserting its importance automatically justifies coercive leverage over allies. The observation is that intelligence nuance has been stripped out. Instead of careful assessments about infrastructure, redundancy, and shared command arrangements, we hear absolutist claims about indispensability. This is not analysis, it is messaging. The intelligence failure lies in allowing partial truths to harden into totalizing narratives. Yes, Greenland hosts key radar assets. Yes, Arctic routes matter more as ice recedes, but intelligence has long shown that missile defense is a layered system, dependent on integration, not ownership. When policymakers imply that inadequate Allied stewardship constitutes a threat requiring unilateral correction, they are not responding to intelligence gaps. They are creating political ones. The strategic consequence is erosion of trust. Allies hear these arguments not as invitations to invest jointly, but as preludes to pressure. Adversaries hear something else entirely, evidence that American confidence in its alliance system is fraying. The analytical breakdown points to a familiar pattern. Geography is being weaponized rhetorically to compensate for strategic anxiety. By elevating Greenland from a shared security node to a symbol of unilateral necessity, policymakers sidestep uncomfortable questions about burden sharing, coordination, and long-term commitment. Intelligence is again repurposed, this time to validate urgency rather than assess risk. Analysts who point out that existing agreements function adequately or that coercion could backfire are drowned out by declarative certainty. The hard lesson is one intelligence officers are trained to respect. Terrain does not confer control by itself. Control emerges from relationships, agreements, and credible commitments sustained over time. When geography is militarized rhetorically, it becomes a substitute for diplomacy rather than a component of it. Greenland, in this sense, is not about radars or runways. It is about how far American strategy has drifted from managing alliances toward managing impressions. And impressions, no matter how forcefully asserted, do not intercept missiles, stabilize regions, or reassure partners. They simply make future cooperation more fragile. One of the clearest signals that a strategic narrative is failing is when allies are reframed as obstacles rather than force multipliers. From an intelligence standpoint, alliances are not sentimental arrangements. They are systems designed to distribute risk, capability, and legitimacy. When those systems are functioning, intelligence assessments emphasize integration and coordination. When they are not, the language shifts. Europe, increasingly, is described less as a partner and more as a problem to be managed. The observation here is that narrative warfare has turned inward. Instead of assessing adversaries, policymakers are busy constructing explanations for why allies are allegedly underperforming. Intelligence is selectively deployed to support this shift. Underinvestment, political hesitation, and historical complacency are highlighted, while shared successes and structural interdependence are minimized. The intelligence failure is not in identifying allied weaknesses. Those have always existed. It is in presenting those weaknesses as justification for unilateralism. The strategic consequence is predictable. Allies who feel publicly chastised or strategically sidelined hedge. They invest in autonomy, diversify partnerships, and question whether American commitments are conditional on obedience rather than mutual interest. From an analytical perspective, this is a dangerous trait. The short-term satisfaction of asserting dominance over allies comes at the cost of long-term cohesion. Intelligence that should be mapping pathways for cooperation is instead enlisted to build a case for pressure. The analytical breakdown reveals how this happens. When policymakers assume that credibility flows from command rather than consent, intelligence assessments are reshaped to emphasize leverage over legitimacy. European caution is framed as incompetence. Debate is framed as delay. Institutional complexity is framed as weakness. These frames simplify decision-making but distort reality. They ignore the fact that alliance systems derive their strength precisely from negotiation and compromise. The hard lesson here is not ideological, it is operational. Alliances cannot be coerced into resilience. They must be cultivated. Intelligence officers know that trust, once eroded, is costly to rebuild and impossible to fake. When narrative warfare is directed at partners, it signals to adversaries that the coalition is brittle, and brittleness invites testing. Europe becomes a stage on which American confidence is performed rather than a platform through which collective security is maintained. That shift may feel assertive, but it is strategically corrosive. The recurring promise behind the iron fist is simplicity. It reassures policymakers that complexity can be mastered through willpower, that resistance is evidence of insufficient pressure rather than flawed assumptions. Inside intelligence institutions, this doctrine exerts a quiet but corrosive influence. The observation is that analysis increasingly bends toward affirmation rather than interrogation. When leadership signals that strength equals decisiveness, intelligence learns to frame ambiguity as noise and dissent as obstruction. This is not how self-deception announces itself. It arrives as alignment. Analysts convince themselves they are being pragmatic, that caution sounds like weakness, that the moment demands clarity over nuance. The intelligence failure lies in mistaking institutional consensus for accuracy. Once the iron fist becomes doctrine, contradictory data is not refuted, it is deprioritized. Reports that highlight adaptation, blowback, or diminishing returns are buried under more confident language. The strategic consequence is a narrowing of options. Policymakers come to believe that escalation is the only lever available because intelligence has stopped presenting alternatives as viable. The analytical breakdown exposes a structural problem. Institutions reward those who reduce friction between intelligence and policy, not those who introduce it. Over time, this creates a culture where intelligence serves as an amplifier of intent rather than a check on it. The iron fist in this sense is not merely a policy posture, it is an organizational bias. It privileges forceful solutions because they are legible, communicable, and emotionally satisfying. Yet, intelligence history is littered with examples showing that force without adaptive strategy produces diminishing returns. The hard lesson is one the intelligence profession once taught rigorously: confidence is not the same as clarity. When institutions train themselves to equate firmness with correctness, they lose the capacity to detect their own blind spots. Self-deception becomes systemic. Failures are reinterpreted as evidence that even more pressure is required. Success is defined so narrowly that it cannot be falsified. In such an environment, intelligence no longer functions as an early warning system. It becomes a narrative maintenance tool tasked with preserving belief and control rather than assessing its erosion. And once that transformation is complete, the iron fist stops being a means to an end and becomes an end in itself. The final cost of narrative-driven strategy is not measured in headlines or press briefings. It is measured in the quiet recalculations of those who no longer take American assertions at face value. Credibility, in intelligence terms, is cumulative. It is built when predictions align with outcomes and when commitments are sustained beyond political cycles. What I observe now is a widening gap between what is declared and what is believed. The observation is that American power is still formidable, but its signaling has become unreliable. When control is proclaimed too often and too loosely, audiences stop distinguishing between demonstration and capability. Intelligence failure plays a central role in this erosion. By allowing analysis to be shaped by narrative needs, institutions sacrifice their most valuable asset, their reputation for accuracy. The strategic consequence is loss of trust without immediate loss of power, a dangerous intermediate state. Allies hedge not because they doubt American strength, but because they doubt American judgment. Adversaries probe not because they believe the United States is weak, but because they believe its responses are scripted. The analytical breakdown underscores how this happens. Intelligence that should be stress testing assumptions instead reinforces them. Warnings about escalation, ladders, alliance fatigue, or adaptive adversaries are diluted to preserve confidence. Over time, the gap between internal belief and external perception grows. Policy remains loud, influence grows quieter. The hard lesson is stark. Power that is not trusted must be constantly reasserted. Each assertion carries cost. Each escalation reduces flexibility. Eventually, even allies begin to treat American declarations as provisional, subject to revision with each new narrative shift. In intelligence work, this is known as reputational decay. it does not announce itself with a single failure. It accumulates through small mismatches between claim and reality. The collapse of the American strategic narrative is not the loss of power, but the loss of credibility as a reliable interpreter of its own power. When intelligence becomes fiction, when it exists to sustain belief rather than confront uncertainty, strategy loses its anchor. The world adapts accordingly. And once adaptation sets in, no iron fist, no matter how loudly advertised, can restore trust that was eroded by design.